Hey everybody, it's time once again for another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes. Welcome back to the show, and today we're continuing on in our compositional series. Our subject for today is rhythm. Now, the last bunch of episodes that we did, we had our rules series where we had rule of thirds, rule of odds, rule of space, and basically these rules are techniques that, if you apply this certain technique, whatever that rule is, that you'll achieve this visual effect. And it's up for you as the photographer to determine whether that's right or not for the composition you're going for. So whether it's something you want to use or something you want to avoid. And starting with today with rhythm, we're talking about now conceptual, they're really not rules at all. They exist. And so any composition, you're going to have some kind of rhythm to it. And I think these are the kinds of things that if you can learn to pay attention to them, they're going to improve your skills as a photographer in your compositional sense dramatically. And how many of us have been out shooting, or we're shooting an event or shooting something going on, and we come back and we have some okay shots and they weren't quite right. And I think rhythm, and we're going to talk about tempo, these kind of have musical metaphors that go with them. But there's certain things that if you can learn how to control them somewhat, I think you're going to have better luck in getting more accurate, more interesting, your compositional sense is going to improve drastically. So I think the best way to talk about this is let's go over to the computer and let's look at some images. And today we're going to talk about rhythm in composition. So in terms of rhythm, and I want to speak to the metaphor that, visual art, the metaphoric connection that visual art has to music, because I think it's more obvious in music than it is in visual art sometimes. I mean, we see things in a certain way, but I think the level of abstraction that we can comprehend visually is much greater than what we can typically comprehend as far as music goes. When music gets really sloppy, it gets very maybe offensive to the ear, very dissonant and very difficult to deal with. But if we think about rhythm in music and think about something that's like a drum beat, you have a series of pulses that your brain interprets. Some of them are equidistant apart. There's some kind of backbone that keeps that in some kind of continuity that we hear, and then other pulses kind of come in over the top to counter that. And if you kind of consider some of these pulses like objects in visual composition, I think you can really start to draw a metaphor or a very strong connection between visual art and music, or in our case, photography. And I have some examples here. One thing that, if you look at the Karl Blossfeldt, which is a very beautiful photograph, very organic, speaks very much of nature. There's a strong pattern that's going on here with the 6 spirals that you see. It's fairly easy to comprehend. And this is kind of straight ahead rhythm. It's very balanced. It's very even. You're going to find stuff like this in a lot of musical types, like maybe classical music, where rhythms tend to be straight ahead. And rhythm also goes along with melody sometimes. And so you can see how just the placement of these objects and then the way that they're turned or the way they work together, you kind of have a melody that counters it. And I hope this isn't getting too metaphysical on you, but, stuff like that adds a certain amount of congruity to it. Now, another thing in music that we deal with rhythm is what's known as syncopation. And this is where basically you have rhythms that start to counter or pull against or pull away from the main pulse. This becomes syncopated, and it starts to make it feel less natural than it was originally, but it still works. Like you find this a lot in jazz music, or even, in modern rock music, there's a lot of syncopation to it. If you take an image like the Richard Avedon, which is a very strange image, to say the least, with these women who appear to have extremely long necks and they're bubbling out of something. I don't know. It's quite a wild image. But one thing that makes this work is it does have, some of that, similarity to the Blossfeldt in terms of, you've got a structure. You have, in this case, 5 heads instead of 6. But this one's more syncopated. It starts to work a little bit off the scale and off the beat a little bit. And he does that with the scale and the fact that not everybody's on the same plane. So you see some of the heads are further away, plus the subject's just bizarre. So that's, I think one thing to kind of consider is how syncopation in an image like this differs from something like the Blossfeldt, where it's more straight ahead. You could make the argument that the Blossfeldt is slightly syncopated because of the way that these spirals are turned. It just adds a nice harmonious beauty to it. But, you really start to see stronger syncopation in other places. Another thing I think of, like you take an extreme image, this is also Richard Avedon. This was one of the later portraits that he's known for. This is a portrait of a beekeeper, which is almost a disturbing image, but in probably one of Avedon's, particularly for his later period, best known works, because it's so discomforting maybe to look at, this guy with bees all over him. Apparently he's not getting stung. But you have certainly this mess of rhythm that's displacing. You've got this guy who's extremely pale, this odd-looking bald man with huge ears, and he's covered in bees and this weird pattern of these little, you couldn't tell. If you had one, it'd be hard to tell it was a bee, but, but the fact that you have this grouping of them. And the fact that, there was no arrangement to this, it just naturally happened. But there's a lot of, dissonant syncopation that's going on in something like this because there's so much activity that's going on. So a rhythm in this image is going to be much more full, much more lavish, well, maybe not lavish, but much more intense, I guess, than something that is just a handful of objects that are placed in a certain way. So something to consider in composition to try to vary this up. And I think your range as a photographer and what you're capable of doing visually, a lot of that is going to speak from how you handle rhythm components in your images, so to speak. I think another interesting example is this is a contemporary photographer, Brian David Griffith, who I think is one of the up-and-coming guys to watch. He does these amazing photos. I originally saw a print of this. It was printed, it was a palladium on some kind of rice-based tissue paper, and it was just beautiful because it's kind of a high-key image to begin with. And it's obviously a figure descending up some stairs. There's some focus issues with the image, but that's part of the artistic quality. But it's so minimalist that really all you make out is the figure moving or ascending the staircase, I assume, not descending, and then the outlines of the two forms that make up the stairs. And so something like this, the rhythm is slowed down immensely. There's very little activity going on, and it has a certain effect. There's no right or wrong way to implore rhythm in your composition. I think this is one extreme, whereas the beekeeper's another. The rhythm is very slow in this one. The beekeeper is very fast and frantic. Now, we're going to talk about tempo in a separate episode because I kind of have a personal definition that's a little different for that. But in terms of rhythm, you can vary the speed and the density that's going on. And I think that, density is something, to think about. Another image, and actually I have a bigger one of this. This is a wonderful image. The great civil rights photographer Ernest Withers. Let me pull up a bigger one that I opened up. And you can see that there's a great amount of rhythm that makes up this composition. These are protesters during the civil rights movement that are holding up signs that say, "I am a man." And you see an enormous amount of repetition, an enormous amount of rhythm. This is not as scattered and crazy as, say, the bees had the effect of in that other image. This is a little more in sync. It's a little more predictable. It's a little more harmonious and less dissonant, but still dense at the same time. There's a lot going on, but because you see that repetition. So the other thing that I want you to take note of is the use of repetition to define rhythm. All these images that I'm showing you now, with the exception of the escalator or the person descending the stairs, they're like objects that are working together. Okay, so another two images I want to show you real quick. This is Hannah Starkey, who's a contemporary photographer, and I think she's just got such a beautiful eye for composition. These are untitled works. These are women standing next to a wall, but you see, and think back to when we were talking about groupings of threes or odd numbers, the rule of odds. Well, there's not an odd number going on here, and it doesn't really even work out like that, but the image still works because the rhythm is interesting. You have a solo figure over here, you have a group of three over there. Well, if you consider them two groups, you end up with two, so that's not an odd number, and there are four people total, so that really didn't work out either. Technically, there are seven because there's these three figures that are carved into the stone, but it works well. There's a really nice rhythm, and I think your eye is directed and kind of guided through this piece. When I see this, I tend to drift towards the woman with the red dress in the front first, and my eye naturally leads over to the other group of women. And who knows what they're thinking or what they're saying, or I don't know the story behind this image. Another one, this is also Hannah Starkey, that I think is just beautiful, is this woman in a mirror. She's touching the mirror, and there's a woman giving her a scowling look in the reflection. But despite the potentially uneasy nature of what's going on or what story's being told here, this is a beautiful composition in the way that it leads your eye from the right side of the frame to the left, and it does this with rhythm and pacing. You have the repetition of this woman who sees herself in the mirror and they're touching. That starts to give you the repetition, and it leads straight over to this other woman and completes the story or the picture, however you want to look at that. So anyway, another great rhythmic concept. And then finally, another great Avedon image this is a portrait of Twiggy, who was a supermodel in her day, 1968. And the way the hair moves in this, it's outrageous. It's Fantasia-like. It brings a lot of interest. But it's the rhythm in this is all done with the hair, and there's an enormous amount of activity. This is not a sharp image. There's a lot of motion going on, and I think this is also a great example where you don't have to have everything exactly in focus to create interest. And I think that's what's going on here. Is there's a lot of motion and a lot of activity. So anyway, just some thoughts on rhythm. Rhythm can be pretty broad. There's different people are going to have different definitions of how this works. But for me, what I look for is repetition, syncopation, the kinds of things that are going to create interest compositionally. And a lot of this just comes down to, learning to see, look through the viewfinder, learning to wait for a better moment, learning how to frame things up, learning to figure out what you need to do to get a better image. And rhythmic pacing is a lot of what goes into that for me personally. So anyway, if you get any questions or anything, make sure you check us out on Facebook, hit me up on Twitter, whatever your social media of choice is. You can also visit our website, which is theartofphotography.tv. And appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time.